So today I'm going to be covering monitoring and performance testing of data grid applications, and specifically JBoss Data Grid 6.2. This webinar is the third and final part of our webinar series. Last week we covered developing and configuring a simple data grid application, and this week we'll be using that exact same application to perform monitoring and performance testing on. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what we'll be covering today. Firstly, for those who didn't join last week, I'm going to give you a brief overview of our actual environment, of our data grid environment, so the number of clusters, the number of nodes which our data grid application will be hosted on, the type of application it is, a brief overview of our configuration settings, etc. within JBoss 6.2, JBoss Data Grid 6.2. Following on from that, following on from that, we will be going to actually give you an overview of various different tools one can use for monitoring data grid applications. Primarily we'll be using today JConsole, which is JMX based tool for monitoring our data grid application, and secondly I'll show you how to set up and configure JBoss Operations Network 3.2 to monitor our data grid application. And lastly, we'll briefly touch upon performance testing, and here's one specific tool which we can use to perform performance testing on data grid applications, called Radar Gun, which was developed side by side along with InfiniSpan, and it's quite a cool tool to use. So let's jump in the deep ends, so just give you a brief overview of our application from which you will be monitoring. It's basically a simple data grid application. So it's a hot rod client server application. So firstly, I'll give you an overview of our actual environment which the data grid application will be running in. So previously I've already done this. I have downloaded JBoss Data Grid server from the Red Hat site, and I've configured 3 different data grid nodes on JBoss. JDG 6.2. So just to show you quickly the configuration which I had used, what I need to do, which allow us to set up the actual application. That actual application we have developed is a hot rod client server application. So we'll basically have a hot rod server running on a data grid instance, and we'll have a remote client which will run, in our case, on a desktop, which will connect to our distributed cache to perform operations on it, such as put and get, cache-based operations on a distributed cache. So just to give you a quick overview of actual configuration, you can see here we've got a hot rod connector. This allows us to basically allow clients to connect to our hot rod server. And within here I've created a distributed cache with a number of different settings. I won't be going through each of the specifics settings, and we went through these last week, but basically this is a distributed cache whereby 2 copies of the cache entries are deployed on our 3-node data grid cluster. and I have that exact configuration which you're using is deployed, same configuration is deployed across each of these 3 nodes in our data grid. And just for simplicity and to save time, I have here come in and I've actually started them up briefly. So you can see here that at present we have 2 nodes in our cluster, in our data grid cluster. And to show you quickly our actual client application. So our client consists of 2 simplistic classes. Our application, our hardware application hosts basically cinema entries, cinema objects, cinema name and list of shows. So each cache entry contains a cinema object in the cache, and these are distributed among each of the 3 different nodes in our data grid cluster. And just to give you a brief overview of, show you quickly, our application running. In our case, we have used Maven to automate development and running of our hardware client. So in this case, I'm just going to execute Maven exec Java. So you can see here we've got a number of different options, and within our application we've added a new cinema object to our cache. We can add a show to cinema, remove a show, print all cinemas, and quit. So if we show you present within our cache, our distributed cache across our two nodes, 3 different cinema objects with 2 shows here. If I wanted to add, just to show you briefly, add another cinema in. We call this test cinema entry. And let's add a show into apologies for the spelling. Wilson 3. And we just want to add 1 entry and show those lists of service. So that has now been added in to our application. So if we go in, now we're going to show you JMX, and one specific tool you can use for monitoring our objects, or monitoring our data grid instances. JGrid called JConsole, which you're all familiar with. It comes with your JDK hotspot. If we connect in, if we come in here, if we go to under the MBeans tab, JBoss Data. So within here, we can monitor our caches deployed to our data grid cluster, our cache manager objects. We can look in the J groups to view the actual number of different nodes in our cluster consisting of a data grid application. Just one quick note, if we were to go back, to ensure that we can capture JMX statistics. Just quickly, you need to set up the JMX statistics to be true value. So just double check what that is. JMX. Yes, on the cache container itself, we have set here, if you see, in order to allow you to capture JMX, you can see this statistics parameter is enabled on a cache container object called clustered cache. So that will allow us, if that was set to false, then we wouldn't be able to view, invoke JMX and beans. So just to quickly show you here, this for example is the name of our cache container. You can see it's called clustered cache. You see our status, our actual cache. We want to see statistics. So what's the hit ratio of distributed cache, number of evictions if you had evictions, set up on your cache, average read write time, set here. There's also a number of different operations one can set on your cache, just start, stop, clear your cache, etc. by JMX. So it's quite a number of useful information held there. Just to quickly, I have set up here also a number of replicated cache and invalidation cache. So you can see here under this cache branch, or the cache directory within JConsole, you can view all the different caches which are set up within our cache container. So same thing set up within here, cache attributes, say what's our stats, what's our hit ratio. These are very important numbers when we wish to find out how our cache is performing. Cache manager instance, if we want to see how our cache manager is performing, here we go, we can see the size of our cluster. Very useful, the number of nodes in the data grid, to create cache count, then our cluster, the status. You can see here in our cluster members attribute the actual different members which a data grid consists of. So yeah, JMX is quite a very useful tool to use. We'll see how your your data grid is performing. So next I'm going to give you a brief overview of how to set up and configure John, which stands for JBoss Operations Network, which is an administration management tool to monitor multiple different types of applications. But in our case, we're only concerned about monitoring our data grid and how it's performing, so the hit ratio, the number of caches, etc. So download the relevant software to allow us quickly go in, show you exactly where we are, click on downloads, middleware and downloads. So within here you can see the under the management menu, we've got JBoss Operations Network. And within here you wish to use the latest version, which is 3.2. So I have downloaded that previously to save time rather than waiting for it to download. I download that onto my local machine. Furthermore, you wish to download the Data Grid plugin. So JBoss Operations Network relies on a number of plugins to allow it to basically capture relevant metrics for particular resources. So in our case, we need to download the plugin software and deploy that to the server to allow it to run to monitor actual data grid application. So you will need to download that, and in addition, you will also need to download application plugin pack for JBoss Operation Grid Network. This tab here. Okay, so once you have downloaded them, you will use it. I have downloaded these previously, these 3 different zip files. Unzip them. I have set up John32 on my local host, a Windows platform. There's a number of prerequisites that you need to fulfill before installing John. Firstly, set up relevant database. John supports 2 different types of database, Oracle or Postgres. I'm going to use Oracle 11xe, and within there you should create a user and grant that user the privileges to to connect to the database. Furthermore, since I'm running this on a Windows 764 machine, you need to download JDK 6 or greater on 32-bit, because the actual services that are running, agent, server, and storage, rely on a 32-bit VM in order to actually run. So once you have set up the relevant JDK and your database user, you should go in and run the setup. I have done this previously, but in terms of operations you need to perform, in order to run the installation, you use the rhqctl command. So you type in rhq space install -- start to install your storage service, which is Cassandra based, your rhq server and agent. So that will take, I have done this previously, the day before. So once they have been set up, you should check, since it's on Windows, that they're installed okay and the services are running. And in my case, I have, you can see here, the 2 Windows servers, rhq server and storage, are set up on these 2 particular nodes. Now to come in, so once you have come in, and seen that the service, the rhq server, storage server, has started up correctly, what you should do is set up your plugins. There's a number of different ways which you can deploy the plugins, either through the actual rhq web console, or by hot deploying them into the plugins directory, restarting your actual rhq server service. In my case, what I've done is I deployed the plugins. So you can see these different plugins here. So they're basically just jar files. So that's it's a very relevant different JDG plugins for JBoss Data Grid. So drop all of them into our server instance or plugins directory and click restart. And what you should see they have deployed okay. You should see the relevant different plugins in your administration console. So I will log out just to show you what it looked like first instance. So I deployed my server to my local machine, so it's localhost. By default, it's on port 7080, the RHQ server is running on. You will come in firstly, and you will log in. I've preset this up for what you would do. So when you first come off, you wouldn't see these actual plugins in place. So what happens is the actual previous step we took to deploy the plugins, various different plugins, JDG and JBoss EAP, John EA2, EAP2 have been hot deployed. But now, in order for to allow those actual plugins need to be distributed to each of different clients who are listening and monitoring our actual instance. So we have deployed an instance, an RHQ server previously on my local host. Since each of my data grid nodes running on my local host. I have an agent here which is running on my local host. You can see here I have an RHQ agent, and when I first set up I wanted to set up a new configuration, so RHQ-clean config option. When you first start up, it says what name do you want to give the actual agents, agent host name, port, RHQ server it should connect to, RHQ port, and then it will start up. And it will now listen. So what will happen now is that when the agent starts up, is we need those plugins to be deployed from the server to our client, to our agents. And so once the agent starts up, it will scan and look for relevant plugins from the actual server. So just to check that the actual plugins have downloaded, you can see in here within the plugins, the server will push these relevant jar files to your actual agent. Start monitoring your instance. So once you have the relevant plugins installed, you now need to go into our inventory to say, okay, what actual services do we wish to monitor? And I have done this previously, but normally what you would see, you would first click on the discovery queue, and you would see here is my two instances which I've imported previously into my inventory, and they will now so what you will see is two data grid instances here being monitored. So when you first come in into here, just to show you briefly for this particular difference, you would normally have to import your specific resource which you wish to monitor into here. Since I've done this previously, I have already JDG, my two data grid nodes already in my inventory. Within here, just to show you quickly, they're being monitored at present. One caveat which you do need to do also is to check your connection settings. So you need to, on your JBoss Data Grid 6.2 server, you need to add an actual user into a management to that management realm to allow your agent to connect to your JMX console or to your admin console. So this is not normally set, so you need to ensure that that has been set up correctly. Otherwise, you won't be able to monitor any resources deployed to that data grid instance. So when you come in here, you will be able to view a number of child resources. As part of that, we're interested in JBoss Data Grid /InfiniSpan resources, and there's multiple ways which we can configure our resources and what metrics we wish to view. But just to give you a quick sample, we can see here this is the distributed cache which we wish to actually monitor. You can see here there's a number of different operations and stats which we can add in. So you can come in, log a number here and say, okay, I want to add number to current cache entries, remove puts to the actual default dashboard. So there's a multitude of operations and stats which we can add to our dashboard in RHQ to be viewed from resources. This here, you can see here is the dashboard that I have created, just simply by performing the operation I did previously. So I want to see my read-write ratio for my directory cache instance for JDG. So here's the very statistics. One can be the hit ratio, the number of cache hits, the number of cache puts, etc. And it will monitor those resources in real time. Okay, lastly, we're just going to briefly touch on performance testing. It's just one of many tools which you can use for performance testing, called Radar Gun. Just a bit of history on actual Radar Gun. It was developed by the guys who developed InfiniSpan, which is the unsupported open source version of JDG. So they wanted means to actually test performance of the data grid products against InfiniSpan, various other data grid products against InfiniSpan, and also test performance of their own actual data grid applications. So they wrote and developed an application called Radar Gun, which is available on GitHub. I'm just going to briefly show you what to do to set it up. I'm run a simple test to test your cache instances. So I have preset this up earlier on. There's a number of different steps setting up Radar Gun. It's available on GitHub, which you can download and check out the code, and you'll need to download and install Maven into your environment and build the actual project. Build your Maven project. And so once you have done that, so you should have Maven 3.0, I believe, installed, run that in the root directory. Radar Gun master branch, go to your target distribution directory, Here's the actual build. Within Radar Gun, there's a number of different plugins which allow you to test different data grid products. So you can see Hazelcast, Infinite Span, EHCast, Hazelcast, and JBoss Data Grid plugins. You can also download and place in here. In my case, I have just set up to test against a local instance running on one machine. So within my environment, there's multiple different benchmarks you can configure within Radar Gun. It comes with stress. Comes with an application which allows you to stress test your data grid application or data grid settings. It's basically based on a session scenario where you have multiple different session IDs which would be normally held within the cache. So multiple read and write operations on your cache. So in order for me to run actual simple test locally, you can see here there's a number of different configurations you can use. So here we set up the actual test which we use. In our case, the application is the stress test application, number of requests, threads. Here is important. So depending on the application or product you will be testing, you specify that here. So in our case, it's Infinite Span 6. The reports. So once the test is ran, the number of reports will be automatically generated for you, which will consist of amount of memory used, average puts, on your distributed cache, number of gets, number of reads, writes, etc. So it allows you to analyze how well it's performing. In my case here, I'm just going to quickly show you. I have a sample.xml is the name of my Infinite Span 6 configuration file, which you can see here. And it's just simply distributed cache. And within here, you can see that within JBG. Within our sample, since Infinite Span relies on JGroups, we have our JGroups placed within here also, so we can find. So once you have done that, there's a number of various different options which you can run depending on different types of tests you want to run. If you want to run run the local stress test locally, then you'll execute local.sh scripts. If you want to execute the stress test application on a number of different nodes, you run your distributed.sh. But you will need to ensure that if you're going to run the distribute.sh, then you need to configure benchmark.xml, which is similar to local benchmark.xml that I previously looked at. Just some further settings involved. Okay, well, I think that concludes everything I wish to discuss today. So there are further included here some further references for you to look at, including our homepage, CGB2, our blog site, and further good documentation on John on the Red Hat site in terms of the administration configuration guide. User guide is quite very useful. Okay, well that concludes our webinar. and have a good evening.